all set? Okay. First, let's get some background information about your experiences in Afghanistan. When was the first time you went to Afghanistan, and why did you go?
I arrived here in May 1980 in Peshawar, and 1 month after I left to Afghanistan. At that time it was very confusing, the situation was very confused, and we didn't know exactly how to enter inside Afghanistan. And we established a small dispensary here for the refugees during the time we could get a way to go inside. And we met a commander from one region which is near of the border inside Afghanistan. He saw us and he told us that they didn't have any doctors or medicine since 3 years. And we agreed to go with him. That was my first trip inside Afghanistan.
You're on holidays.
Veel te doen, man. Morgen moet je werken, veel te doen.
Ja, morgen, vandaag.
Nou, er is enough to do hier as well.
Let's start again to make sure that we eliminate all the rickshaw noise and everything. Tell me about when you first came to Peshawar and went into Afghanistan.
The first time I arrived here it was in May 80, and 1 month after I left for inside Afghanistan. That time the situation was very confused. There were hundreds of thousands of refugees coming from Afghanistan. And we met a commander who was living not very far from the border inside Afghanistan, and he told us that he didn't have seen any doctor or medicine since 2 or 3 years. So he asked us if we could come to help them, to help the population.
Now, who is we?
We were 2 doctors from Aide Médicale Internationale, which is a French medical organization, private organization. And we started the work there. I came back, other doctors came. I went to another area to start a new mission, medical mission, and I did that for 6 times during several years. I spent about 1.5 years inside Afghanistan. The third trip I had done was to Panjshir Valley in 81, and then I came back a second time in 82.
Tell me, go back again to 1980. This was only a few months after the Soviet invasion.
Mm-hmm.
What motivated you to come to Peshawar to see if you could help in Afghanistan?
I think that Afghanistan in a certain way was a hazard for me. I mean, some of my classmates, France, had set up this organization, Aide Médicale Internationale, and they asked me if I wanted to start this first mission inside Afghanistan. I didn't have any idea of any medical practice in the third world. To be frank with you, I was quite afraid of the war situation, but I thought it was also a very nice and very interesting human experience. So I think it's my first motivation. But when I arrived here the first time, then I was very impressed by the Afghans. The way they were convinced that their war was just, and they had to fight for their freedom. So as a human and as a citizen, I was very impressed to see how much they wanted to defend their freedom. And the less we could do, it was to help them.
Tell me about the first trip inside Afghanistan.
Oh, the first trip was very impressive for me because, again, I was afraid of the war. And when we climbed the first mountain, it was 12,000 feet. It was in Nuristan. And when we reached the top of the mountain, then it was the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And all the Mujahideen who were with me, they hanged up their weapons just in front of mountains. And they told me, now you are free, you are inside Afghanistan. And I was absolutely surprised. So more surprised because the way where we were going down was full of mines. And it was a very, very narrow way where we could walk quietly, but not going in the grass anywhere else because it was dangerous.
Who planted the mine?
The Russians. I mean, at the time of when there were so many refugees coming from Afghanistan, they landed a lot of mines on the border just to frighten more the people. And there were a lot of casualties at that time. I saw the mines in the grass myself. It was a small butterfly plastic mine, green or marron or brown mines. Yeah. And the second thing I was very impressed, it was on the medical side. As a foreign doctor, I realized that there were no more medical resources for the population. That means no any hospital, no any doctor, no any nurse for hundreds of thousands inhabitants in this area where I was. And that was a shock for me.
When did you first come in contact with the war? What was the first casualty that you had to deal with?
The first casualty was in Panjshir Valley. That was the first and the following one because there were a lot of casualties at that time. There was what was surprising at that time. It was early in the war time. There was a permanent front at the mouth of the valley. That means there were permanent front of Mujahideen and Russians. So regularly the casualties were coming back from this front. And beside the preventive medicine, medical cares, there was a lot of surgery to be done.
And how many doctors were you?
The first team we were 2, male doctor and me as a woman doctor. And then I asked for a surgical team to come because of this surgery to be done. And then we used to send for 4 years in this Panjshir Valley teams with 3 or 4 people, no more, because for security reason, and always a mixed team, male and female.
What kind of facility did you set up in there?
We set up a hospital at the middle of the valley. At that time in Panjshir there was about 100,000 inhabitants. The first time I went it was in 81 and the situation was quiet during the 3 months I stayed there. There had been 4 offensives before my coming, but during the time I was there it was quite quiet. But when I came back the situation had changed a lot. I mean there were 2 or 3 bombardments every week on the valley, on the villages. And when I arrived, I saw that the population was not living more in the valley during the day. All the families were going to the mountains, hiding themselves during all the day, and they were coming back at 5 or 6 o'clock in the night in the houses to make all the homework, all the field work, and so on. And the next morning, if it was sunny, the population was going back to the mountains.
What was were you fairly well equipped? What were you equipped to take care of? How long could you last? What kind of casualties and injuries?
We were able to last for 6 months for surgery cares and medical cares. We were bringing all the surgical equipment from France and we were buying most of the medicines here in Pakistan. But you know, it's a special way for working. It's a very difficult situation. There is no electricity, there is no current water, so everything is done regarding the field. And finally, it's not a sophisticated equipment, but it's a very useful and adapted equipment. And we could do laparotomies, we could do amputations, we could do quite a lot of surgery. But not, for example, bone surgery because it requires too much good equipment and good ambience. I mean.
Was it a frustrating thing to be able to see people die that you could have saved in different circumstances if you had more sophisticated
You know, I think we have saved most of the people we have seen, and from all the other medical teams I could meet when they returned, there were not a lot of people dying by lack of cares when we could be there. And it's a good reflection for us as foreign doctors to see how much we are medicalized in our mind, because finally we have lost we don't realize how much a body can defend itself. And as doctor, it's a good lesson for us to see that we can do a lot without a very sophisticated equipment, but with a good adapted equipment.
Now, your presence in Afghanistan was, I'm sure, soon noticed by the other side.
Oh yes,
Reaction.
oh yes, the Kabuli population, the Russians, I mean the Afghans living in Kabul knew that there was a good hospital in Panjshir, and unfortunately the Russians also, they knew that there was a hospital. The second time I came back, 1 or 2 months before, during the time there was another team, the hospital had been bombed. So when I arrived the second time, the first days I went to see the Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was the commander of Panjshir at that time, and I asked him the permission to put a big red cross on the roof of the hospital. And he laughed. He told me that it will be best target for the airplanes, but he agreed also in a certain way. He agreed. So we went to the bazaar and we bought a large piece of red cloth, and we put that on the roof. And 1 month after, the hospital has been bombed.
They did use it as a
And we went on the top of the mountain to see if the Red Cross was even visible. I mean, was enough big, and it was big. I mean, we took some pictures of the hospital, and it's clear that there is a Red Cross on the roof.
And what about your own personal safety? I understand that you were threatened.
We were very well taken in charge by the Mujahideen and by the population. Both together, it was quite a good security, but in the same time we were at the same level than anyone. That means the airplanes was not doing the difference between the villages and the hospital or house or schools. And even that in the Panjshir, all the schools who were set up at that time, the hospital we had set up were quite systematically bombed. There was no doubt on that. I mean, it was target for them. And at the end of the second mission, I stayed there 6 months, and the 2 last months, there was a very big offensive. Never the Panjshiri population had seen that before. There were hundreds of helicopters and MiGs bombing all the principal valley. All the population had left to the small valleys around, and everybody were refugees in these small mountains, small valleys, I mean. And we were a part of that, and we tried to treat the people who were wounded. And after 13 days of this offensive, some leaflets used to be landed by helicopters from the first day. But the 30th day, the leaflet was speaking about ourselves, saying that Massoud had left the valley with the 2 French prostitutes. So all the Mujahideen who were with us, they were laughing because they used to see this kind of leaflets. But myself, I thought that we should be perhaps more careful because it was obvious that we were interesting for them. So after a few days, the situation was really terrible. It was impossible to go out of the caves. It was bombing and bombing every time. So we sent a message to the commander Massoud, who was on the other side of the valley, to ask him what to do because of that and the security. And several days after, 2 weeks after, he sent us back a message telling us that the Russians were looking at us in all the villages. So he was ordering us to go back to Pakistan because it was too dangerous for us and for the population and for the Mujahideen. The fact to have 2 foreigners were creating some security problem for the population also. And when we arrived here, it was 1.5 months after the beginning of the offensive. I met some friends who were waiting for us here, and they were absolutely surprised to see us coming back, and they told us, but you are not in jail in Kabul. And I didn't understand why. During the time we were in Panjshir, the Russian ambassador in Islamabad said to the French ambassador that they had captured the 2 French doctors. So the foreign affairs in Paris, our families and so on, they thought that we were in Kabul in jail. And that's it.
When was the last trip you made into Afghanistan?
It was at the end of '84.
And since then, what have you been doing?
Since then, we have set up medical training here in Peshawar because we were doing a lot of medical training in the missions inside Afghanistan. And because of the increasing of the war in '84, everything was becoming very difficult in terms of training. You need to have a quiet ambience to train some people. So we decided to set up a medical training here. That was the work in '85. And in '86, I had been asked to be a part of the team of MSH, which is an American organization based in Boston, who has been contracted by USAID to try to implement a system of health for all Afghanistan. And I'm working in this organization for the time being.
In the time since you first went in 1980, there have been lots of changes, lots of things have taken place in Afghanistan. A lot more medical assistance has arrived in Peshawar. Has this, and I've heard complaints about some aspects of the medical system, that people are trained in too short a time and sent in not knowing what they're doing and so forth. How do you respond to that?
I am more optimistic about, because I believe very strongly that the Afghans are able to do a lot of things, and the best proof is what they have done during 8 years inside Afghanistan during this war. They have been able to fight against a Red Army, but you don't fight like that. You get organized, you get the population organized, you set up administrations to do such a long-term war. And the Afghans have done a lot inside Afghanistan during these 8 years. And I believe that there are some good supervision in enough regions to be able now to trust the Afghan. I mean, I saw them working, I worked with them inside, I'm working with them now, and I believe that all of them, they are able to make a lot of things, and especially development programs. Because since 8 years, the commanders, the authorities inside Afghanistan have been obliged to take in charge all the population, because the situation was and is still very difficult for them. And in a war effort, they have done perhaps much quicker than if they should have been in a peaceful time. And for me, it's an argument for the people who are taking care of development program. That means that a population is able to set up quicker a development program under a war situation, because they are obliged to do quickly the things. And from 80 to 88, there is an enormous changement. For example, on health side, you have now some regional health systems with regional health officers who have been nominated by the commanders, by the population, and they are running their show. They are running system of health very well, and we have to help that. as much as we can. And since '85, there are several trainings who have been set up here, who are finally doing the new medical Afghan generation, because for many reasons, the medical personnel who was before the war had been obliged to come here or to go to Europe or to America. And there is a lack of doctors and nurses, and the medical personnel which is trained now is very useful.
We have to change tapes.